career of somebody like our final speaker, Senator Jack Danforth, a former U.S. Senator from Missouri. It is a huge privilege to introduce him. In a time when we so desperately need statesmanship, when we so often seem to have forgotten what statesmanship even is, I don't think we even use the term much anymore. I know that because I have taught for 3 years a class called Leadership, Statesmanship, and Democracy at UVA. He stands out as a leading light from a not too distant time of what we can all still become. Senator Danforth served in the United States Senate as a member of the Republican Party from 1976 to 1995. His areas of interest included trade, tax policy, and civil rights. In 1999, he was appointed special counsel to investigate the federal raid on the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, so returned to that role after having been in the higher branch of the legislature. He was appointed U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations in July 2004 by President George W. Bush. An ordained Episcopal priest, he authored the books Resurrection, Faith and Politics, and The Relevance of Religion. And prior to his election to the Senate, he served in the extremely practical role of Attorney General for the state of Missouri from, am I saying it, Missouri, right? Okay, from 1968 to 1976. He graduated with honors from Princeton University, where I was an undergraduate, and I graduated in 1995, which was the last year that he was in the Senate. And I remember very well the example that he was, the slogan of that university going, which has been in operation for a couple hundred years, was Princeton in the nation's service. And there really is that ethos that they try to teach to a lot of graduates of service. And also received a Bachelor of Divinity degree from Yale Divinity School and a Bachelor of Laws from Yale Law School. And he's still a partner in the law firm of Dowd Bennett here. Welcome, Senator Danforth. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, Mike, thanks, and thanks to everybody for being here and for taking on these important issues and for doing that here at Washington University and in St. Louis. It means so much to us. The idea that Washington University and that St. Louis, we think, right at the center of the country, can be deeply engaged in this subject of bringing the country together is so good, and we thank you for it. Mike told me that immediately after my remarks, everybody's going to a bar. And so he said, so get on with it. So here goes. The impetus of this meeting is last year's Charlottesville riot, where 3 people died and many more were injured. In the same year, the number of hate crimes in America rose 17%. There's plenty of hate and violence to lament, but to your credit, you are not satisfied with dwelling on the past. You are looking to the future, searching for solutions, hoping that the horror of Charlottesville will not visit your communities. As you look to the future, I'm going to suggest that you do so in light of America's historic challenge. Our challenge always has been to hold together in one nation a diverse and often contentious people. That remains our mission today at a point in our history when America and its communities are falling apart. In these remarks, I'm going to offer some thoughts on how, in our time, we can meet our challenge and what we can do to hold ourselves together. Holding this diverse nation together always will be a work in progress. We can never be content that we have completed the task. We can always hope to move ahead. Unity is an aspiration so broadly shared that it's part of the American creed. We aspire to be a perfect union. We stand together, hands over our hearts, and pledge allegiance to one nation, indivisible. We have a motto, E pluribus unum. We are from many, and we are one, a united country. That is how we see ourselves. That's the America we want to be. But in several ways, as I've already noted, our one indivisible nation is coming apart. This isn't an original observation. Many have commented on it, and all of you know it to be so. For one thing, over the last half century, we have increasingly become an assortment of separated individuals, detached from the communities that have held us together. We have lost what academics call social capital. David Brooks has called this the atomization of society. You know this from your own experience. What you see in restaurants is people looking at their iPhones, not talking to each other. We hoped that modern communication and transportation would help create community, but they have done the opposite. We have become more isolated. We sit alone in front of our computers. We sit alone behind the wheels of our cars. The title of Robert Putnam's famous book describes present-day America. Instead of belonging to bowling leagues, we go bowling alone. We have come a long way from the 19th century America Alexis de Tocqueville lauded as a nation of joiners bound together in networks of community organizations. We have lost our tolerance for people who are not just like us. If we don't agree with them, we dismiss them or we attack them. After the 2016 presidential election, 33% of college students blocked or unfriended on social media people who voted the other way. Students exercised the heckler's veto over unpopular speakers. There's a word that's recently gained a lot of currency, tribal. You see it all the time. Amy Chua has written a book called Political Tribes. Here, in a nutshell, is her point. Everyone in America today feels threatened. African Americans fear that their children will be shot by police. Mexicans are threatened with deportation. Muslims are told their religion should be barred from the country. Women are abused by workplace predators. Poor whites feel left behind in a country that calls them trash. Religious conservatives are threatened by popular culture. Amy Chua notes that when people feel threatened, they retreat into tribalism. They identify passionately with their group, and they see others as the enemy. The Charlottesville riot was the result of tribalism in its most virulent form. An assortment of neo-Nazis and white supremacists carried swastikas and Confederate flags and shouted anti-Semitic and racist slogans. President Trump proclaimed that there were very fine people on both sides, implying that there was a moral equivalence of fascist marchers and counter-protesters. It was an outrageously destructive comment by a man without a moral compass. Racism and anti-Semitism warrant nothing short of immediate and unequivocal condemnation. But here's the good news. The overwhelming majority of Americans do not in the least resemble the fascist marchers in Charlottesville. The vast majority of Americans are good people who care about justice and who mean what they say when they pledge allegiance to one indivisible nation. This is more than sentimental thinking. There is scientific evidence that it is human nature to be in community and to care for one another. Matthew D. Lieberman is a professor at UCLA and director of its Social Cognitive Neuroscience Lab. His specialty is the scientific study of how our brains work. He concludes that humans are wired to be social animals, to cooperate with one another. He attributes this to evolution that rewards altruism. Babies who are cared for by their mothers survive, while babies who are abandoned die. 10 men who band together against a wild animal have a better chance of prevailing than one man who stands alone. According to Lieberman, we are alert to our social surroundings. We take clues from others about what makes cooperation with them possible. This is hopeful news, because if it is human nature to live in community and cooperate with one another, there should be a way forward toward countering the kind of hate that led to violence in Charlottesville. And that way forward means that it will be our responsibility to honor basic goodness, to evoke it, and to take those actions that will unite us as a people. Some of those actions must be governmental. Others will involve ordinary citizens. First, what can government do? Minorities will not consider themselves participants in one united country if they think the authorities are out to get them. It's important for people in government to understand that these beliefs do exist and to mitigate their causes. The lesson of Ferguson is that many African Americans are convinced that they do not receive fair treatment from law enforcement. Rightly, after the Charlottesville initiative is focusing on police-community relations. That focus should include minority hiring and promotions in police departments. It should also extend to correcting perceived disparities throughout the criminal justice system, including in sentencing and incarceration. Immigration is a difficult issue because there must be reasonable controls over entry into our country. But in developing these controls, and especially in the rhetoric politicians use to debate them, it's essential to avoid any hint of racial, religious, or ethnic discrimination. De facto housing segregation creates communities separated by race. Also, it is correlated with income inequality when inner city residents are physically distant from employment opportunities. Adequate transportation between where people live and where they might work is needed to bind communities together, and an important subject for government attention. Organizing peaceful community responses to demonstrations by neo-Nazis and other hate groups will depend on private sector engagement, but it would benefit from participation by local governments. Suppose a community that anticipates the arrival of hateful demonstrators could simultaneously produce 10 times as many people, not for violent confrontation with the demonstrators, but to gather in a different part of town and make a powerful statement of tolerance and unity. Such a response would require a degree of planning and execution unlikely to originate in the private sector alone. that would profit from encouragement by local government. Finally, government officials, especially those in elected politics, are more than advocates and implementers of specific programs. They are leaders who have public megaphones and they can use those megaphones for good or for ill. Often what they say is more important than the programs they advance. They can appeal to the best in us, or they can appeal to the worst in us. They can divide us. That is the tactic of demagogues. Or they can bring us together. That was the genius of Abraham Lincoln, who toward the end of the Civil War called on Americans to bind up the nation's wounds. We should demand leaders who hold America together, and we should call out leaders who drive us apart. Now for the rest of us, those not in government, what can we do for our country? In her recent book, Amy Chua gives a sobering account of how threatened people retreat into us against them political tribes. But she concludes with a message of hope. She notes that all over the country, there are signs of people trying to cross divides and break out of their political tribes. She tells of Unitarians and Bosnian Muslims in Utica, New York, who watched the Super Bowl together. After the 2016 election, people on both sides in Hackettstown, New Jersey, came together just to be with each other. They adopted a slogan, "Make America Relate Again." If people in Utica, New York, and Hackettstown, New Jersey can find creative ways to overcome tribalism, there is no reason why people in your communities couldn't do the same. Your work would be to identify well-motivated groups and encourage them to work together in common efforts to bridge their differences. Where would you find such groups? I think the first place to look would be our religious congregations. You could meet with faith leaders where you live and enlist their help in holding your communities together. In their book, American Grace, Robert Putnam and David Campbell make the case that participation in a congregation has consequences beyond religion and rebuilds social capital we are losing in our atomized society. We know that religion is often more divisive than uniting. We learn this every day with news of violence committed in the name of God. In our country, we have guarded against divisiveness by creating a wall of separation between church and state. But to say that church should not be entangled in government is not to say that religion shouldn't be engaged in the affairs of communities. Indeed, most faithful people believe it must be. They are not willing to check their faith at the church door. And while religion is often divisive, it shouldn't be. The root meaning of the word is the same as for ligament, that which binds us together. Faithful people want their religion to be relevant to life around them. They want to make the world better. Especially, this is so in response to hatred. They have a need to be together and to act as one. We saw this in St. Louis a month ago. On Sunday afternoon, the day after the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, 1,500 St. Louisans gathered for a vigil at the Jewish Community Center. They were Jews, Christians, and Muslims. One of the most powerful messages was delivered by the Imam of the Islamic Foundation of Greater St. Louis. He said, "As you can see, we are in the battle together to fight hatred and to fight bigotry." Faithful people take their guidance from the prophets of ancient Israel, confronting injustice where they find it. You can help them consider a ministry that is particularly relevant for our time, a ministry to a fragmenting country, what St. Paul called a ministry of reconciliation. Here's a familiar example of the practical consequences of such a ministry. On June 17, 2015, 21-year-old Dylan Roof attended a Bible study at an AME church in Charleston, South Carolina. After about an hour, he shot and killed 9 members of the group. At his arraignment 2 days later, relatives of the victims said, "I forgive you. My family forgives you. I want to be sure that hate doesn't win. We are praying for his soul." These words changed a state. 5 days after the shooting, the governor stood on the Capitol steps, surrounded by Republicans and Democrats, black and white, and announced that the Confederate flag must come down on the Capitol grounds. This was South Carolina, where the Civil War began. The families of 9 people touched the heart of a state and changed a culture. They changed a culture. That was the way to move beyond the church shooting in South Carolina. That is the way to move beyond the riot in Charlottesville, where so much in our culture is driving us apart. America's work, as it always has been, is to create a culture that holds us together. After Charlottesville, looking to the future, as you are doing, searching for solutions, as you are doing, I believe that the place to begin is where we began more than 2 centuries ago, to once again take up America's historic challenge to make a more perfect union, to make of many one, to pledge and pursue our allegiance to one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Now to the bar.